Uh, Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Politics and Prose at the Wharf. I'm Brad Graham, the co-owner of the bookstore, along with my wife, Lissa Muscatine, and we're really delighted to be hosting veteran journalist David Rohde, who's here to talk about his new book, Where Tyranny Begins: The Justice Department, the FBI, and the War on Democracy. Now, David has worked for some pretty great news organizations during his long career. He's been with the Christian Science Monitor, the New York Times, Reuters, the New Yorker website. He's currently the national security editor at NBC News. Back when he was a foreign correspondent in the 1990s and 2000s, he twice won the Pulitzer Prize. Once for his coverage in 1995 of the Srebrenica massacre of Bosnian Muslims, and again as part of a New York Times team covering America's military and political challenges in Afghanistan and Pakistan in 2008. He also was held captive twice, once by Bosnian Serb authorities who kept him for some days, and later in Afghanistan by members of the Taliban who kidnapped him for 7 months. David's written several previous books: Endgame, about the Srebrenica massacre, A Rope and a Prayer, about his abduction by the Taliban, Beyond War, about the need to change U.S. policies in the Middle East, and a few years ago, a book called In Deep, about the notion of a deep state in the U.S. military intelligence and law enforcement communities. In his new book, Where Tyranny Begins, David examines how Donald Trump, during his years in the White House and since, has used various means: threats, conspiracies, conspiracy theories, co-option, to intimidate, divide, and discredit officials at the Department of Justice and the FBI, and bend those officials to his will. These efforts, David writes, have put tremendous pressure on and weakened the post-Watergate norms that were adopted by the Department of Justice decades ago to prevent the use of the department and the FBI for political purposes. Part one of David's book describes Trump's actions during his years in office, and each chapter looks at a different tactic that Trump has employed. And part two deals with the Biden years and efforts led by Attorney General Merrick Garland to bring Trump to justice while at the same time trying to restore institutional norms of fairness and independence from politics. David's critical of Merrick Garland for not being more outspoken and for acting too cautiously and too slowly at times. But he also contends that DOJ itself remains hampered by its own rules, and he argues that additional reforms are needed to rebuild much diminished public trust in the nation's law enforcement institutions. Now, much of what David recounts in his book may be familiar to those of you who have followed these events closely, but piecing all of Trump's actions together make clear the full scope of Trump's assault on the Justice Department and the FBI and the threat that this has posed. Also, another of the book's strengths is its focus on some of the key career civil servants at DOJ and FBI who've been involved in politically sensitive cases and their view of what's happening. David's dispassionate voice and his concise, thorough reporting combine to provide balance and clarity in this very informative narrative. Now, in conversation with David will be Hallie Jackson, the senior Washington correspondent for NBC News, anchor also of Hallie Jackson Now, and anchor of the NBC Nightly News on Sundays. And you may remember, back during the Trump presidency, Hallie was NBC's chief White House correspondent. So ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming David Rohde and Hallie Jackson. Okay, why don't you take this?
Perfect. Thank you. Hi, everybody. How are we feeling? I couldn't hear anything that was just said. Thank you for that lovely introduction. It's great to be with you all. David Rohde, everybody. We're thrilled to have him. As I'm sure you know, David and I work together at NBC, and I'm so lucky and so honored to be able to moderate this book conversation with him tonight because it is a gripping read, and it happens to be pretty newsy. David, if you caught my show at all this week, was on talking about the book, because there have been a number of developments related to the Justice Department, related to former President Trump over the course of the last 5 days or so. So you're the perfect person to talk about it with, and we're just thrilled to be able to do it. You know, one of the things that I always like to sort of start a conversation with, and we'll go through the book, some of the key moments. I love to ask authors about their process, how this comes together, how they got people to talk to them, because in this book in particular, you'll notice on the first page, David writes that most of the people who spoke with him did so anonymously out of fear. They were scared for their jobs, they were scared for their positions, and so getting into that I think will be interesting too. But let's start with what gave you the idea to write this in the first place. You've covered a lot, you've written a bunch of books, as we just heard. Why did you decide to take pen to paper on this topic, and what was the moment during probably the Trump presidency or just after that you decided to do this?
Thank you, Hallie, first for doing this. I'm very lucky that Hallie's here with us tonight. And we'll talk for about 30 minutes, but we want to take questions from you and let you drive this conversation. Why did I do this? That's a question that we were just talking about my wife and my daughters. I've got a 15-year-old and a 10-year-old who would just shake their heads when they would, get up in the middle of the night to go to the bathroom, and I'd be sitting at the kitchen table hammering away at this book.
And we know 15-year-olds notoriously love everything their parents do.
Yes.
So it was quite the shock.
I'm nothing but a source of embarrassment for my daughters. But I wanted to write, and I'm sort of very proud actually to be at NBC News, a fact-based, non-partisan, I'm going to use those terms a lot, history of what actually happened in the DOJ and FBI and the amazing, historic, and very fraught, period we've all just lived through in terms of the Trump administration and now the Biden administration. And views of both have become so polarized in the country. I really wanted to focus on the average FBI agent and DOJ prosecutor who sort of lived through all this and how they saw it, and what actually happened. And so I set out on this great idealistic journey. I'm just the facts, ma'am, and it's all going to go great. And as Hallie mentioned, people were just afraid to talk. Should I make a joke about Washington lawyers? Do we have any Washington lawyers here? I mean, people don't, become career, prosecutors to get rich. Most of them. Some of them leave and do. And most FBI agents don't become FBI agents to get rich. And so they live a largely, particularly the FBI agents, sort of middle-class life in the city. And what I found is that they felt very threatened that when Andy McCabe, the deputy director of the FBI, had his pension revoked, I covered that. We all covered that. And as journalists, we sort of watched it from afar. And that's just one example of how deeply the threats, the conflicts, the public attacks actually burrowed into the workforce at the Justice Department and FBI and really did impact people and their mindset and the way they saw their jobs. And there's still fear there now. We can talk more about sort of the opening passage of the book, but our hyperpartisanship is, steadily infiltrating, infecting maybe the two most powerful law enforcement agencies in this country, the Justice Department and the FBI. They're not paralyzed yet. They haven't sort of been corrupted, but it scares me to see how that process has happened and the impact it's having on the mentality of people inside the organizations.
It doesn't just scare you, it clearly scares the people on whom you base this book, the sort of characters that we meet on the record and the many that we meet on background or not by name. How did you get them to open up to you and reveal some of this, David? Was it that promise of anonymity? Was it your longstanding relationships after so many years covering this?
My previous book was about, In Deep was a look at sort of the deep state. Is there a deep state? And I met some of the people who helped me on this book when I was working on that project. But it was time. It was sort of sitting down and meeting with people, promising them that I would keep them anonymous. This was a 3-year effort, and I ended up just agreeing to make a lot of people anonymous. There's a senior FBI official who's still not named in the book, a senior former FBI official, and I tried incredibly hard at the last stage of the process to be like, can I put your name in here, here, and here? And even sent that person a version of the book with all these quotes. And the person just said, and I'm going to say something critical of President Trump, but this person was like, you cannot put my name in this book. It will destroy, I've left the FBI. It will destroy, his career, his reputation, and the place where he was working. And I abided by his request. So it was, I think I underestimated that. And I guess the joke about Washington lawyers would be that, are they risk takers? I think some of them are. But I'll say this again over and over, I praise public service. I praise these public service. I think we need more bipartisan public servants, whether they're election clerks who are going to count the votes on November 5th, or judges, who rule on cases, or public health officials, or nonpartisan journalists. And I worry that we're sort of spiraling into this world of conspiracy theory to a certain extent from both sides of the political spectrum that, I think it could lead to paralysis, some political paralysis, and I do worry about political violence possibly at some point.
One of the central themes that you explore in the book, and sort of a thread as you take this sweeping look at the arc of the Trump administration, sort of before, after the implications, up into present day and President Biden and Attorney General Merrick Garland. But you document what you describe as some mistakes that are made, and these mistakes have a similar theme. It's the central tension between Donald Trump says a lot, the DOJ says almost nothing, and creating some issues again and again, in your view, in the public eye. And you give some examples, like, for example, when former special counsel Robert Mueller, his decision to pass judgment, you write, on whether Trump had obstructed justice was an example of how the norms of the 1970s were ill-suited for the Trump era. Mueller said nothing, and Trump said everything. You also talk about Rod Rosenstein, of course, that explosive meeting that I think people may remember that was proved to be a pivotal moment where top staff at the DOJ essentially threatened to resign if he did, in fact, install Mr. Clark as head of the DOJ. Rod Rosenstein, you say, never revealed anything about that at the time, and you call that, too, a critical mistake. Talk about that central tension between a president who, at the time, was taking these almost unprecedented steps in stream of consciousness, tweeting, saying, talking out there all the time, and a Justice Department for whom that was anathema.
One of the central characters who did go on the record is an Alabama native named Jody Hunt. He worked in the civil division at this Justice Department for years, basically dealing with civil litigation. And Jeff Sessions asked Jody, who's from Alabama, they didn't know each other, but to be his chief of staff. And so for the first time in Jody's career, he took this political position. And Jody Hunt's view was that, and I think this is right, and it's important for both sides of the political spectrum, a democratically elected president has a mandate from the voters to carry out certain policies, and this is how the Justice Department's supposed to work. And the Attorney General should carry out these broad policies, crack down on crime or whatever they want. But what the president should not do is involve themselves in individual criminal cases, go after somebody who didn't give him enough campaign donations. And so Jody Hunt becomes Jeff Sessions' chief of staff. He's very excited. And the Muslim ban is the first act by Trump when he's there. And there's, the famous incident, Sally Yates, the acting deputy attorney general, resigns. Jody Hunt thought that was wrong. Or sorry, she doesn't resign. And sorry, this is an important difference. Sally Yates tells everyone else in the Justice Department, she's a holdover from the Obama administration, to not defend the president's executive order in court. And Jody thought that was wrong. Like, let the Supreme Court rule that the executive order is unconstitutional, but it's not the role of civil servants to sort of block this kind of policy. To make a long story short, Jody Hunt watches Trump abuse Jeff Sessions after he recuses himself, which was the right thing to do from the Trump-Russia investigation. He's present in the Oval Office when Trump is told, when he slumps in his chair after learning that there's been a special counsel. The words, "I'm fucked," that Trump slumped in his chair and said, "I'm fucked," are because of Jody Hunt and the notes he took that he gave over to the FBI. Jody ends up resigning from the FBI when John Bolton's book, there's an effort by the Trump White House to prevent John Bolton from publishing that book, and that was just too much for him. He thought that the presidency would change Trump, and instead Trump changed the presidency. And he fights back, and we can talk about the folks who didn't go public, but ironically, he leaves the Justice Department, and he ends up getting a pro bono case or hearing about it from a friend, and he represents Cassidy Hutchinson, who testifies in the January 6th commission. He's sort of like a Zelig figure from like the Oval Office with Trump and Sessions to the January 6th committee hearings. If you see the pictures of Cassidy Hutchinson, he's
right behind her.
He's right behind her. The joke his wife says is the handsome Clark Kent lawyer behind him. But I'm just trying to humanize these people in these institutions who are trying to do the right thing. But again, he just kept. There's a systematic underestimation of what Trump is willing to do, and he admits it himself now. And again, his concern is that the public just doesn't trust the Justice Department and FBI. That the partisan attacks that politicians from both parties have, they benefit politically from attacking the FBI and DOJ, and the DOJ can't really defend itself. And as the public gets more and more suspicious, we're losing trust in our institutions.
I was looking for a pen because you said something that I think is worth coming back to. You used the word systemic underestimation, and there's I think a very vivid illustration of that in the book, and that is the underestimation that Donald Trump would actually fire James Comey, which he obviously did. And you write in speaking with Rod Rosenstein and doing your reporting here that he, and I'm looking for the quote here. He didn't talk about it because he didn't believe that former President Trump would actually fire Comey to hide the Russia investigation. Rod Rosenstein had written a memo explaining why he thought that should be the case. And you write that he acknowledged he may have been being naive in that, but ultimately, if he thought that the former president would fire Comey to end the Russia investigation, he would not have written that memo. Can you talk a little bit about that underestimation and the perhaps naivete of some of these Justice Department officials in dealing with President Trump at the time?
Again, he's seen as erratic and saying all these crazy things and tweeting all these things. But if the first part of the book on Trump, each chapter is about a different tactic that Trump uses. One is disparage and discredit, that just publicly attack whoever's accusing you. Another one is spread conspiracy theories. And the mistake is since Watergate, the modern Justice Department, this idea of an independent attorney general, and that presidents don't get involved in criminal investigations is really a legacy of Nixon. Every president for 50 years obeyed those norms and never dared meddle so openly with a special counsel investigation. And Trump did it over and over again. And I think past presidents thought they'd be punished for that politically, but Trump wasn't. And so there's a systematic underestimation of it. And then lastly, the way Trump sort of viewed the court system, maybe this is sort of a Roy Cohn tactic. The very first chapter of the book, and this is a term that a liberal critic of the administration came up with, in terms of what the kind of legal tactics that these Trump administration lawyers use. They called it, I'm going to look old here, LOL or LOL, laugh out loud. But it's chapter 1 is LOL, nothing matters lawyering. And it's a view of the court system as you file a lawsuit or you take a legal position and you're trying to get a message out, dominate the press, create a lot of buzz, B, fire up the Trump base, C, own the libs, and D, maybe get Trump's attention and he'll praise you. And so it's not about winning the legal case based on the facts or the law. It's just about using the courtroom as sort of a stage to get across your political messaging. And so, again, it's just all these, and I applaud their idealism, these civil servants, but all of them sort of being shocked over and over again about what was coming at them.
You talk about getting out on a stage. If there's something that Donald Trump knows, he will tell you it is a stage and it is a performance. He is, of course, a former reality show maven, if you will. And there is an anecdote in the book from somebody named Erica Newland, where she talks about at one point in the process, she was at the Office of Legal Counsel, the OLC, and she talks about how at one point she had been reading about how Donald Trump worked with the staff of The Apprentice at the time, and how a number of these staff members had come forward talking about how they were sort of editing things in post to make Donald Trump sound more coherent and to make his ideas sound more cohesive. And she says that she realized that OLC was in many ways doing something very similar with the former president when it came to some of the legal issues that were in front of them here. Talk through that.
So she's working at the OLC, and Erica is again on the record. She actually wrote an op-ed for the New York Times about her experience in the Justice Department. She also, and we're in the Atlantic building, she spoke to George Packer, who's a friend of mine, an Atlantic writer, about her experience as well. But she felt like they were basically fixing the travel ban. And it took 3 or 4 versions of it, but they were able to,
Over a period of time.
over a period of time, but it was eventually held up by a more divided Supreme Court. I think it was a 5-4 decision. But there's a line she uses about that she felt that essentially in the end, was she protecting Trump, from his own lies? And she stayed and didn't resign and tried for, I think, 2 years to sort of uphold the norms of the Justice Department, uphold the Constitution, and that doing her job not in a partisan way, just trying to uphold the law would be a check on, a president, Republican or Democrat. And she, in hindsight, wrote that was a mistake, that by staying there, she was enabling him. And she's just a very thoughtful person, and was super helpful. And I was, again, and brave, because she said all this on the record.
So as time goes through, and as you chronicle some of these repeated issues that have come up and that did come up in the course of the Trump administration, the Trump presidency, it sort of brings us into more current moments. President Biden, Attorney General Garland, and of course the classified documents investigation. And there was something that struck me, because you write how there was once it was decided that more information would be revealed about this search, and it was not easy for the Biden administration to determine to do this search, to conduct this search at Mar-a-Lago, a search that the former president revealed himself, if you remember, on his social media platform, talking about this raid, quote unquote, as he called it. As information about the search was becoming public and the Department of Justice was determining what to release, they decided to release some photographs that I'm sure all of you have seen, of those boxes of classified documents, the files, as you write, on the flowered carpet of the Trump office. Frankly, now iconic images, for better or for worse, of what the DOJ alleges was the wrongdoing from the former president. In this instance, you spoke with several people who sort of alluded to the fact that we understood that the optics would be important here, that the average Joe would look at this messy pile of files on the floor and say, well, that's not right. Something's probably wrong here. And in some ways, it seems that some of these DOJ officials did learn that the presentation mattered to a degree, which is a lesson that the former president knows well.
He's a master. Whatever people want to say about Trump, he's sort of a master when it comes to communicating and messaging. And he's very consistent and sort of relentless. And so there's a whole separate story I can tell about the fight about when and how to go into Mar-a-Lago, but they go in, and immediately Trump declares that Mar-a-Lago is occupied and exaggerates everything. And they're in a positive. So in the past, the Justice Department would sort of sit back and file legal papers, and there weren't usually pictures in them at all. And there's a younger generation in both the Justice Department and the FBI that knows in the digital age and in a hyper-partisan age, you cannot just sit back. You will be defined by your political opponent, and you have to, somehow respond differently. And it was exactly what you said. So all of those pictures, it was a debate about whether to include the pictures in the criminal indictments and from Mar-a-Lago, and this younger generation essentially won that fight. And that's why there's pictures of stacks of boxes in the bathroom. I mean, they're also those are the actual pictures. I spoke to one of the people who, they came up with this idea, which picture would it be? And this person went through all the pictures and I think helped pick that picture, the one of the flowered carpets with all the top secret documents on it. And, we're TV people, or I'm a writer, but, the power of a picture is 1,000 words. And to say, here they are in a bathroom, on a stage, scattered across the floor. And so it was interesting to see these institutions evolve. And my worry, to sort of nerd out on you, is that these norms of a completely, and I wanted to stay nonpartisan, but the post-Watergate norms are 50 years old now. our politics, our mode of communication, our culture's changed dramatically. And I think if the DOJ and FBI are going to retain public credibility, they need to be more transparent. They just released today the actual transcript of the interview, I believe, with this young man, the young man who carried out the shooting in Georgia. And I mean, again, I'm nerding out, but it's very interesting that the FBI released the entire transcript of the agent's interview with that boy's father. And I think that is this realization. We've got to be more open about what we do. What did we hear? What did that guy tell us? Because there's so much out there on the web that paints the worst of whatever the FBI does.
And so you now have these multiple investigations, federal cases against former President Trump, both of which have been in the news just this week, the classified documents case as well as the federal election interference case. And yet one of the arguments that you make in this book, David, is that for progressives, for those on the left, there was perhaps a sense that one of these indictments could have been a silver bullet early on in the Biden administration to perhaps take former President Trump out of the political conversation in any kind of meaningful way. And you quote a couple of writers in the New Republic who said they were frustrated that Merrick Garland was in charge, that President Biden kept him in charge, and said that every day that Biden keeps Garland in charge of his legal agenda is a day Trumpism is normalized here. The point that you make is that prosecuting a former president is not and was not and will not be as simple as some perhaps on the left had suggested.
I just want to say what an extraordinary job she's done preparing for this. I mean, she read the book cover to cover and like pulled the best quotes.
It's a book talk, babe. I mean, you know,
don't mess with her is what I'm saying. No, you're absolutely right. And this is, and I will say that, you know, I'm emphasizing more of the things Trump did and the dangers that represents. But I do think on the left there was this belief that prosecuting Trump would be a political silver bullet, that it was just a question of bringing him to trial as quickly as possible, and once the trial's ended, he would be discredited, and that would be it. And I don't think that worked. It clearly helped him with his base. It helped him secure the Republican nomination. It turned out to be much harder, I think, to quickly put a former president on trial who's got great lawyers. And, you know, the legal system is a slow process. It's supposed to be slow. It's supposed to be in favor of the defendant and not the prosecutor. So I think that was a mistake, that there was a sense that simply putting him on trial would be enough. Jamie Raskin, of all people, the local congressman, and I think I was talking to him, and it's a 3-year effort, but I think it was during the January 6th trials. And it's important to get the facts out. And in a way, I wish, particularly the January 6th trial had happened. I think that trials are amazing fact-finding exercises where you would have all these people, Mike Pence, different people who served with Trump testifying under oath about what happened on January 6th and before. But unfortunately, that hasn't happened. But I think that, you know, he said to me, Raskin, we also have to win this political fight. We have to win this politically. I mean, that's what we're sitting in right now in terms of this election. And that I had a senior DOJ official who was very involved in all this say, you know, many people feel that there's an unfair attempt to have the Justice Department and the court system solve the country's political differences. And this person said, you know, the court system's not made for that. We can't do that. You know, traditionally we solve our problems through elections and through Congress and through public debate. The problem, of course, is when we can't agree on who wins an election. But we can get to that separately.
You know, reading this book, which again was a pleasure, was also a real walk down memory lane for me personally. I was our chief White House correspondent in the Trump administration for NBC News, and so from the firing of James Comey, I mean, I remember sitting in the press room there, the Brady press room, and Sean Spicer came out, and there were a few of us sitting in these chairs that are lined up against the wall that you might sometimes see on TV, because we had heard something was going down. There was all this pressure this day. It was building. It was like right before nightly news, which is at 6:30 Eastern, and so this was like maybe 4:30. So you know and Sean comes out, and to the few of us there, he sort of slides open the door, and he has this short statement, and he just starts reading it. And I just remember sending a note. It had nothing else in it to NBC except for a subject line. It was called a hot note, because that's like the everybody stop what you're doing and pay attention kind of thing. And it just said, huge flag, Comey out. And I remember years later, a producer said to me, I'll never forget getting that note, because there was this sense that would he actually do that? And then he did. And then obviously it was, huge rolling coverage, breaking news on the network. From that up until, end of 2020, I had just come back personally off maternity leave. I was there from the Republican convention through the rest of the election, and Bill Barr stepping down and stepping aside. And sort of what an interesting figure he had been in the course of the administration and the reporting that I had done for NBC on sort of where his head was at through these various moments when, after the election, there was this intense pressure on the DOJ to overturn the legitimate results of the election. But Bill Barr is not somebody who you spoke with for this book, despite your best efforts. In some ways, he is maybe your white whale. David, talk us through that, because you talked to a ton of people. You had lemonade with Jeff Sessions down in Alabama.
Yes, that's the lunch in Mobile was one of the highlights. No, and I was really grateful, and I can talk about that separately, that Jeff Sessions met with me.
Talk about
I spent like 3 hours.
Because he is somebody who also was a central figure in those early days, those first 10 months. Again, somebody else who came in as a loyal Trump ally to a major degree. I remember seeing him on the campaign trail as a surrogate at these rallies for the former president, and then ending very, I'm going to mispronounce the word, ignominiously. Is that how you say it?
Yes,
okay.
Close.
Or
I'm not sure either. But Barr actually I want to talk once about Rosenstein. It's just interesting and he talked to me at length. But there's this famous thing where Spicer announces, and then they release the memo that Rosenstein had written about why Comey should be fired. And you can call him, it was just, again, one person who worked in the Justice Department said it was tragic to watch it because there were all these lawyers running the Justice Department who thought they understood politics, but they didn't know them at all. And so Rosenstein never expected his memo to be made public. He was so angry at Trump. And he sort of, talks about that in the book and how betrayed he felt. And then I didn't get to talk really much at all to Barr. I wrote a profile of him for The New Yorker. He didn't like it very much. He's very suspicious of journalists, but Barr is like a lifelong conservative. He went to Columbia, in the early 70s during the Vietnam War protests there. He hated the Vietnam War protesters. He saw them as a bunch of whiny kids. And he really, since he, went to Horace Mann, he's a believer in the unitary executive and a powerful presidency. He gave a speech about this when he was Attorney General. And this will get into the immunity ruling, but it's this very strong feeling in conservative legal circles that Watergate weakened the presidency dangerously, and that, the Civil War, natural disasters, foreign threats, that we need a strong presidency. It's such a huge country to hold it together. And so Barr saw the Mueller investigation as sort of outrageous, as this completely unnecessary investigation that would cripple the Trump presidency. And he, just like everyone else, he comes in thinking he'll change Trump or Trump will moderate, and instead, Trump defies him and everything else. And so it was fascinating, and it's important to understand what he's thinking. In many ways, where we are today, I worry that, Trump and others around him who think the 2020 election was stolen, from all these interviews, those folks really think they're defending democracy. And the danger here is that you have both sides thinking that they're the ones defending democracy, and the kind of divisions that can lead to. I can talk more about Sessions, but...
Talk more about Sessions, because he's also this character, and I say that in a storytelling perspective. And you talk about he's got the chair in his house that he sat in for 20 years in the Senate. He's got the chair that he sat in at cabinet meetings in his house, and he's very proud of these things.
So it was amazing. And it took a long time through a mutual contact to get him to finally agree to meet with me. And I flew down to Mobile and went to his house and walked in, and he couldn't have been nicer. And his wife had made this lunch for us. It was sort of watermelon salad and fresh lemonade. And he was the most powerful political figure in Alabama for 20 years. A senator, and he really believed in Trump. But before he became a senator, he was actually a federal prosecutor in Alabama. He was the U.S. attorney in Alabama. And he really believed in, again, these basic regulations of the Justice Department. And he's only in the Justice Department for 3 days when he is briefed, literally a day, his first or second day as Attorney General, and he's told, Mr. Attorney General, the FBI is conducting an investigation of the Trump campaign. And Sessions says, what? And he was like a senior leader of the Trump campaign. And Sessions immediately said, stop talking about the investigation. I've got a conflict. It's again, there's a Justice Department manual, all this post-Watergate practice that you literally, an example is you cannot oversee an investigation of a campaign that you were an official in. And he recognizes that immediately. Jeff Sessions, many people, you can talk about his political stances. He believes in the ideals of the Justice Department, and he did recuse himself immediately. And he told Trump he was recusing himself, and Trump was absolutely furious.
I mean, never forgave him.
Privately, publicly abused him. You know, he ends up, Sessions ends up resigning, and then he tries to run again for Senate against Tommy Tuberville. And this is, in the midterms, and Trump just savages Sessions again, and Tuberville wins in this race. And so we have this long conversation, and but he just won't cross the line into kind of criticizing Trump. And I kept saying, is Trump a threat to democracy? And Sessions called Trump, well, he's more of a blunderbuss, that he kind of says all these things, and that he felt, January 6th was sort of exaggerated. And then we finished this 3-hour lunch, and he said that he was very angry at Merrick Garland and Special Prosecutor Smith for bringing these indictments against Trump. He said that was discrediting the Justice Department, and he said the really big outrage was the Biden family corruption. So years of attacks from Donald Trump, but he's still sort of in that camp.
I think he called the Hunter Biden case something like the most significant public
yes.
Case
he said I could convict Hunter myself. Hunter, and I'm this is like me being idealistic and the rule of law and all this talk of nonpartisanship. The system, has worked. Hunter Biden pled guilty yesterday, the day before yesterday. Like, he was put on trial, on the gun charges. So, you see that the system does work. But I think people don't see that now because we're in such camps.
Let me just go through a couple more, and then I want to open it up to folks in the audience because we really want to make sure we have time to get to your questions. But as we look ahead here, one of the things that you write in the aftermath of January 6th was that 5 years, and you alluded to this earlier about Washington lawyers, but you say 5 years of Trump's attacks had reduced the Bureau's appetite for risk. What are the implications of that moving forward?
No FBI agent or DOJ official wants to get a very high-pressure political investigation. The first chapter of the book is this meeting about a week before the Mar-a-Lago search. It was one of the participants told me that it was supposed to be a come-to-Jesus meeting. And all these DOJ officials that had been pushing Trump to hand back the documents had just had it, and they wanted to carry out the search. And it ends up in a shouting match where you have on one side these DOJ prosecutors and the other side the head of the Washington field office. His name is Stephen D'Antuono of the FBI. And he didn't want to carry out the search. He wanted to give Trump more time. And it wasn't that he was pro-Trump. And I found this over and over again. It's the deep state. It's not that people are biased, Republican or Democrat. They're sort of biased towards their building, their institution. And he felt that doing the search of Mar-a-Lago would just play in. He said, it's Trump's MO. You're playing into his sort of deep state conspiracy theories. And they went back and forth, and everyone said no other American citizen would be given this much time to hand back these documents. We have to do this. And after this protracted meeting, it just ends in deadlock. And Stephen D'Antuono, the head of the Washington field office, says, I'm not going to have my men carry out and women carry out this search until I'm ordered to do so by my superiors. And that's and one of the reasons he was so concerned was that some of the folks in the FBI had looked up the political donations of the career prosecutor and found that he had given money to Democrats like years earlier. And so they were very suspicious of that prosecutor. And they thought maybe he was out to get Trump. And this is the summer of 2022. This is long after Trump and the beginning of the Biden presidency. And this gets at, again, my fear of this constant partisanship seeping into our institutions. And it slowed Paul Abate. There's only one political appointee in the FBI. That's the director, Chris Wray. Paul Abate, a career guy, an amazing public servant, said, we are going to carry out this search. He ordered D'Antuono to do it, and the search was, conducted. Just one anecdote on D'Antuono, and I'll take your questions. about a week after the search, he's at home. I don't know how he sees it, if he sees it live, but Tucker Carlson does a monologue about what happened with Mar-a-Lago. And so D'Antuono, before he was the head of the Washington field office, he was based in Michigan. And so so Tucker Carlson is like, I have a theory. There's this guy named Stephen D'Antuono. And guess what? What was Stephen D'Antuono before he was in Washington? He was the head of the Detroit field office. What did the Detroit field office carry out? The fake plot to kidnap Gretchen Whitmer that, many conservatives think was fake or trumped up or whatever. And guess where Stephen D'Antuono was on January 6th? He was the head of the Washington field office on January 6th. And guess whose FBI personnel searched Mar-a-Lago? Stephen D'Antuono. And basically, D'Antuono told me, and he spoke on the record, and I was really grateful to him, that it sort of broke his heart, that he was actually the guy resisting or trying to slow. He never wants to say resist. He gets mad at me when I say that. He was the guy who was like asking for more time and trying to slow things down. And he said, like, he said 27 years in the FBI for God and country, and then to be called corrupt, by Tucker Carlson and Jesse Waters. My father, my parents had to see that. My children and my family. And he sort of described his view of public service and being an FBI investigator was like being a baseball umpire, that he was just trying to call balls and strikes and keep the two teams playing against each other. But instead he ends up publicly attacked. And he's been criticized from liberals who said, you slowed down the search of Mar-a-Lago. Sorry, but it's just amazing to me to talk to people and understand what they think and how they go through these.
But that's,
moments.
we know this from journalism, this from storytelling. That's what it's about, right? Is the people, and what is the implication for these, as you say, civil servants who have devoted their lives in so many instances to some of these outcomes. So then I would ask, before we turn it over to folks, and I see Ramsey with the mic, is how do you fix it? Because you propose, listen, you say we've got to kind of get back to some of those norms that you argue have been eroded here. You've also used the word idealistic a few times in this conversation. What is a realistic, concrete way that happens? Because Merrick Garland, as you make clear in the book, tells allies, he's not changing course. He believes that if you get away from this, then the whole thing crumbles.
So Merrick Garland has told, and I don't have an answer. This is like a riddle. Yeah. But Merrick Garland has I made the argument. I talked to his aides and many people around him that why it's back to like the release of the photographs and the search. Like, why isn't the DOJ getting out there more and explaining what they're doing instead of letting Trump, paint these pictures of them? And, Garland has told aides that, yes, we have essentially one hand tied behind our back when we're sort of fighting it out against a political actor. But if there's one thing Merrick Garland believes in, it's the rule of law. And I don't know if you've seen him. He's this very dry person. But there's one thing that he talks about, and whenever he talks about it, he starts to weep. And I don't know if any of you have noticed this. It's his grandmother. He's Jewish. And his very existence, he feels, is due to the rule of law in the United States, the upholding of the rule of law in the United States, because his grandmother escapes the Holocaust, because she's able to come to the United States, and as a Jew, she faces clear discrimination, but she's at least not being sent to a death camp. So his very existence is possible because his grandmother can come here. And so when pushed on this about why don't you fight back more and say more publicly, Garland has told aides, I will never let the Justice Department become partisan. If the Justice Department becomes political, that is the end of the rule of law. And is he wrong to say that? He's upholding the rule of law, or is he, right? Is he being naive and he should be more political? So it's a very difficult situation. If the other side's cheating and you obey the rules, what's the work? And my idealistic thing is you obey the rules. We do straight stories with facts in them. We say there's more abuses by Trump, but we also point out, mistakes by Democrats. And I can talk about a couple of those, but we should let people ask questions.
And with that, who's got questions for David?
First of all, thank you so much. You do a really wonderful job so eloquently and effectively explaining sort of the violations the Trump administration took to, both the extra legal, sort of extra normative actions they took. But one thing I'm wondering about is now we are some 10 years into this Trump moment, and though really those around him have started to build up their own Trump-related jurisprudence. And I'm thinking in particular, you see Clarence Thomas sort of planting a footnote, a signal to Judge Cannon that then leads to her dismissing the case on these appointments clause in the Mar-a-Lago case, dismissing the validity of a special counsel appointment. And she can point to case law to now support this. And the longer this moment lasts, the more they will be able to not only use extra legal means, but at least colorably legal means and legal jurisprudence. So how does push back against that? Like you said, we want to adhere to the rule of law. We want to be the people who stick to that. But when they are also pointing to a sort of rule of law, how do you combat that?
I guess I'd go back to Jamie Raskin, and it's sort of a political fight. And the Biden administration Trump appointed a record number of judges, but I think the Biden administration has been appointing more of them. But you're right in that people in the Justice Department were sort of stunned by that ruling from Judge Cannon, which was essentially that again, special counsels have existed since Watergate. They're this accepted thing. Clinton, hated Whitewater and Ken Starr. So Democrats and Republicans, presidents get driven crazy by special counsels, but no one's ever said they're unconstitutional. So, I don't have a good answer for you. That's an example of sort of this, that view of the strong presidency and this is again the idea that if Trump abuses his power, and an attorney general abuses his power, they'll be held accountable on election day. Again, when you won't agree with the election results, that's what's so dangerous. But I don't think the answer is sort of equally bad, legal rulings from the left. And of one very specific thing I'll give, and there's less examples, and our colleague, Dan DeLuce, one of my colleagues is sitting right here, we work together at NBC, but Ken Delanian was able to get the transcript of the conversation between Robert Hur, the special counsel who investigated President Biden, for mishandling classified documents. And it was an amazing piece of reporting, but it was basically that, corroboration about the president and her saying that he had memory issues. There was the famous, founding in his report that President Biden would come across as a well-meaning older man with memory issues. And when Hur did that, he was savaged by Democrats and by this White House, that it was gratuitous, totally unnecessary. Hur's rationale was that I'm trying to explain why I'm not bringing charges against him. Biden did keep documents for a long time after he left office. And I will just say that, the subsequent presidential debate, showed that President Biden did have memory issues. And I'm not, and a separate issue would be like, Robert Mueller did not find enough evidence to prosecute Trump campaign officials for coordinating with Russia. And I think that's an honest finding. And I think it's important to sort of, and the left was like, no, there was, a coordination and clearly collusion, and Mueller wimped out. It's to sort of accept the findings of special counsels, even if they maybe go against one's political side. Because I found that most people were trying to sort of come to factual sort of law-based findings. Not so much Judge Cannon, to be honest. And again, I'm Mr. Glass half full. 2020 election, what was the branch of the government that really held the best? Not the paralyzed Congress. They did certify the result after the terrible violence on January 6th. But in the month of December, it was the judiciary. It was 80 federal and state judges, conservatives, liberals, Trump appointees, Obama appointees, who all said there is no significant fraud here. And so that was very inspiring. And many conservative judges did the right thing. And that's what's so unusual about and alarming about what Cannon has done.
Who else? Other questions?
Sorry.
This is Dan, my colleague. So this is either going to be a softball or a fastball.
It's going to be a hard ball here. Curve. You didn't delve into this necessarily, but I'm curious. Before the Nixon era, were there instances where these norms were violated or flouted? Is it a relatively recent idea?
The simple answer is J. Edgar Hoover. Massive abuses. It's not new that, J. Edgar Hoover, surveilled Martin Luther King. He investigated John Birch Society, had a list of 20,000 Americans who should be rounded up in the case of national emergency. So there were abuses for decades. And in a way, the Watergate and the Church Committee and all these reforms was a watershed in American history, that you couldn't use law enforcement to achieve your political gains. So that did end. And the FBI, they pride themselves on, I'm not, there's all kinds of problems with the FBI, racial profiling, and many, many things have gone wrong there. But the culture did change. William Webster, who's still alive, he was the first director after Watergate of the FBI, just an amazing guy who really came in and he sort of changed the motto and the thinking of the FBI, that it was the duty of agents to sort of enforce the law and defend the Constitution at the same time. And so I don't think FBI agents sit around at the water cooler and talk politics. They just said you never talk about that stuff. And they really are on this. There's a quote when they're all fighting about Mar-a-Lago that both the DOJ and FBI officials were just like, we don't want this case. We don't want to investigate Trump. They all were like, why doesn't he just turn these documents over? Because they'd seen how Crossfire Hurricane and the Hillary Clinton email investigation had ended all these people's careers. And that's the fear, is that people won't want to do these investigations or conduct them because they see them as, career enders.
Thank you. David, I'll confess I didn't read your previous book about the deep state, but your early comments about confidential sourcing raised in my mind a question, which I've had in other contexts as well. Is your use of anonymous sources, and the fact that by using the anonymous sources you encourage more, I'm a former civil servant, of us to do that, does that strengthen the narrative of those people who believe in the deep state, who see those conspiracies? Because those people who are speaking anonymously to you are not just doing it out of the goodness of their heart. They often have an agenda. In fact,
Yes.
they always have an agenda. You're furthering that agenda. You're allowing it you're enabling it to happen. So is this a moral quandary for you and other journalists?
It's a huge moral quandary. Should I talk about our history or no? Talk about a dedicated public servant in terms of many years in Afghanistan. We actually met there, and we interviewed and spoke to each other there. This book, I had to agree to have more people go on off the record than I ever wanted to. And maybe that's a mistake, but I thought it was the only way I could try to get them. They were all trying to definitely protect their own reputations, but they also, loyalty in a hyper-partisan, environment is more important than ever. So there was a lot of people who worked under Bill Barr and under Jeff Sessions who were hoping that they could be part of, a Nikki Haley administration or a DeSantis administration. And these people, and these are sort of Federalist Society conservatives, they don't want to be named because they think they won't have a future in a second Trump administration. They're afraid of the sort of hyper-loyal Trump people, the Jeff Clarks. So you're right, it's a problem, and it's something journalists shouldn't let someone, go on background so quickly and easily.
And I will say, too, and we can pass the mic around for whoever else has questions. We've got about 5 more minutes left. To be clear, and I know this from knowing you and knowing the reporting that you do and your leadership of our national security and justice team, it is not a decision you take lightly. It's not something that comes easily. It's not something you grant somebody with a wink and a smile. It takes a lot of sort of thought and measuring, as you described, sort of the moral compass, the moral quandary of it all. So just to be clear on that, it's not taken for granted that folks will do that.
But I guess it's again one of the casualties of our politics, that people are so afraid of. There was a former prosecutor who Trump tweeted about, and they were physically afraid. They were going home at night and worried about rounding a corner and being attacked.
They said 70 million people who follow him now know my name.
Yes, and he's like, and I don't have Secret Service protection. I don't have any of that stuff. And maybe I didn't realize the pressures a civil servant feels, but again, the depth of that fear was more than I realized. It was like, oh, it's Andy McCabe and he lost his pension. I mean, that was like an incredibly smart shot across the bow that really shocked people who are just trying to kind of live their lives and raise their families and serve this country. And, they're still on edge, I think, in all these institutions. And one of the sort of basic things, too, is this Project 2025 and this talk of giving the president, again, the unitary executive, a powerful presidency, Schedule F, which would right now I think there's about 3,000 political appointees in the federal government. Schedule F would sort of make many more of them, maybe tens of thousands of them, political appointees of the president. We'd go back to a sort of Tammany Hall patronage system. And Trump says, I need these loyalists to carry out my agenda because all these deep state people are blocking me. And then you have Erica Nuland saying, I'm not blocking you. What you're trying to do is unconstitutional. And then it all goes to the Supreme Court, and then we're back to Justice Thomas. So it's an amazing moment. We're living in a scary moment. But and the most concerning thing is, again, how differently people see this. That I think there's... the very true Trump supporters really think the election was stolen, that they're defending democracy. And and now I'm going way astray, but my coverage overseas and different experiences in life I think that one of the dangers about human beings is there's some people who will cheat and are sadistic or whatever, but the bigger danger of human nature is the human tendency to sort of see themselves as like the heroes of their own story. And I worked overseas and covered the war in Bosnia and Afghanistan and the Taliban. And, the Taliban really believed that the 9/11 attacks were staged. They were convinced that the U.S. was there to occupy the country. They thought U.S. troops were forcibly converting Afghans to Christianity. They thought Afghan women were being forced to work as prostitutes on U.S. military bases. So I don't want to be alarmist, and I've covered these civil wars, but the ability of human beings to say, I'm defending, my family, my values, my faith, my democracy is what leads to civil war. And you see the other side as this, existential threat. So this rhetoric makes me very nervous, and I will endlessly be pointing out the good judges who upheld the 2020 election, and Jody Hunt, who resigns and represents Cassidy Hutchinson, and Paula Bate, who orders the search of Mar-a-Lago. And I wanted to tell the story of those brave people also.
Well, it's a story that you'll read in his book, which David will be signing for those of you with copies here in the next minute or two. Any other final questions? I believe we have one more.
Yeah, suppose you found yourself out in the heartland of this country talking about your book. And a person stands up in the audience and she says, Mr. Rohde, you have really investigated and looked closely at what's happening in the Justice Department with the FBI. Many of us out here have great and deep distrust. What could you do to assure or say to a person with that level of distrust about the institution of the Justice Department and the FBI to help assure them?
And Hallie gets this much more than I do. I mean, as I've done interviews about this book, I get emails, at work and social media attacks just saying, you idiot, what are you talking about, Trump weaponizing the Justice Department? Obviously, Biden has totally weaponized the Justice Department and brought these completely fake charges against President Trump. January 6th is exaggerated, or it was staged by the FBI, and the FBI planted the documents in Mar-a-Lago. And so I will just say, like in decades of covering government, again, people aren't perfect. There are corrupt people. Journalists aren't perfect. I just don't find these secret cabals. I don't find these conspiracies happening. And it's back to my initial spiel. Like, we need to have faith. And there needs to be, I keep saying election clerks, but these are election clerks who aren't making very much money. They're getting vilified by both sides. One of our colleagues, Julia Ainsley, is working on this thing where fentanyl is being mailed to different election clerks around the country, and it's terrifying. And we need to just more trust in each other, in civil servants, that election clerks will count the votes fairly, that non-partisan judges will make fair decisions. Again, sort of public health officials, that we need more trust in each other. and frankly, less hyper-partisanship, because it is a very dangerous cycle we're engaged in now, and it riles up the base of each party's, but it's leading us to at least political paralysis or, again, I worry, violence.
David, thank you so much for talking us through your book. We have about 10 seconds left, broadcast journalist. So let me just ask you, end us on a high note. What is hopeful for you? What do you look at? Is it the idea that in 2020, as you say, those 80 judges preserve
Yes.
the democracy? I mean, what can people cling to if they're feeling like this is a moment of darkness?
Jody Hunt, Erica Newland, Stephen Antuano, who, again, maybe he was wrong to delay that thing, but he thought he was doing the right thing. And so there are these people who come in. I mean, one of the FBI, when they're first like dealing with the documents case, they're like, oh, that we want this like a hole in the head or whatever. And they're like, the real enemy is China and Russia. Why are we why are we stuck with this case? And I really think that's how, that's how most public servants, I want to think most journalists, are trying to do their best at sort of getting to the facts at the end of the day. And maybe that's naive, but I think it's really important to trust each other more and trust in basic facts and people who devote their lives to providing them.
We're so grateful to you for coming and talking with us today, and for the book, and we're excited to have you sign more copies of them here at Politics and Prose. David, thank you very much.
Thank you.